The cold was a constant companion. It lived in the stone floors of the scullery, a damp chill that seeped through the worn leather of her shoes and settled deep in her bones. It was in the water she hauled from the well, so frigid it made her fingers ache and burn. It was in the sharp, cutting words of the head cook, each one a gust of winter wind meant to strip her bare. Ilara had been sold. The thought was a smooth, cold stone she turned over and over in her mind. Not for a grand purpose, not for a political alliance, but for the price of a few good casks of ale and a promise to forget her name. Her mother had called it a new start. Ilara called it a grave she was forced to dig for herself every single day. She was a servant in the house of a minor lord, a place of petty cruelties and endless grinding work. Her hands were raw, her back perpetually sore. She learned to make herself small, to be invisible, to be nothing. It was safer that way. Worthlessness was a cloak she had worn for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to be without it. It was heavy and suffocating, but it was also familiar. It was home. Then came the summons. A decree from the Alpha King, Kalin, the ruler of the northern wastes, the beast of a man who was more myth than monarch. There was to be a tribute. Every pack, every lord, was to send their finest offerings to the capital. Not just goods, but people. Unclaimed wolves, skilled artisans, potential mates. Ilara's lord, smelling opportunity, decided to attend. And in a fit of spite, because Ilara had accidentally dropped a platter of roasted pheasant, he decided she would be part of his tribute. A piece of worthless chattel to be displayed and discarded. She stood on the auction block, shivering. It was not from the cold of the grand open-air plaza, but from the sheer, soul-crushing humiliation of it all. She was lined up with strong-backed warriors and beautiful, hopeful maidens from powerful bloodlines. And then, there was her. Small, scarred from a childhood accident her mother had never bothered to have properly healed, and dressed in a drab servant's frock. She was an afterthought. A smudge on a pristine painting. The auctioneer did not even bother to announce her name. He simply gestured vaguely in her direction. A scullery maid, trained in domestic duties, strong enough for labor. A ripple of contemptuous laughter passed through the crowd of assembled lords and alphas. Ilara kept her eyes fixed on her own feet, on the cracked leather of her shoes. If she did not look up, this was not really happening. If she was invisible, she could not be hurt. But then a silence fell. A heavy, absolute quiet that was more terrifying than the laughter had been. The air grew colder, charged with a sudden oppressive energy. The very scent of the plaza changed, from sweat and perfume to the sharp, clean aroma of pine and encroaching winter. He was here, the Alpha King. Ilara had heard the stories, that he was a giant of a man with eyes of glacial ice and a heart to match, that he hadn't smiled in a century, that his wolf was a monster that devoured his enemies whole, that a creeping, unnatural cold followed him wherever he went, a curse that clung to his bloodline. She risked a glance, a tiny flicker of her eyes from beneath her lashes. The crowd had parted, creating a wide aisle, and he walked through it, a living shadow against the pale afternoon sun. He was larger than the stories claimed, broad-shouldered and immense, clad in black furs and leather. His face was harsh, all sharp angles and predatory beauty, framed by a mane of dark hair threaded with silver. But it was his eyes that held her. They were not ice blue. They were the gray of a winter storm, deep and churning and filled with an ancient, unbearable loneliness. As he walked, a faint frost seemed to trace the stones at his feet. The cold she felt was not just in the air, it was coming from him, a physical, tangible thing. He moved with a lethal grace, his gaze sweeping over the prized offerings on the block. He passed the proud warrior with the silver-sheened hair. He passed the beautiful daughter of the Sunstone Pack, whose hand was rumored to be worth 1,000 soldiers. His gaze slid over them all as if they were made of glass. And then his eyes, those devastating winter storm eyes, landed on her. For a single, heart-stopping moment, the world ceased to exist. There was no crowd, no auction block, no biting wind. There was only the weight of his stare. He saw her. Not the invisible servant, not the worthless chattel. He saw her. Alara's breath caught in her throat. Fear, sharp and immediate, lanced through her. This was the kind of attention that got people killed. The king stopped. He was directly in front of the block, his presence sucking all the warmth from the air around her. The auctioneer, a pompous, sweating man, bowed so low his nose nearly touched his knees. "Your Majesty," the auctioneer stammered, gesturing toward the beautiful maiden. "May I present Lyra of the Sunstone?" "No." The king's voice was a deep rumble like the grinding of glaciers. It was not loud, but it cut through the silence and vibrated in Alara's very bones. He raised a single, leather-gloved hand and pointed directly at Alara. "I'll take this one." The words, quiet as they were, hit the crowd like a thunderclap. A collective gasp went through the assembled nobility. The auctioneer's jaw dropped. Alara's own heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was a mistake. He had to be mistaken. Her former lord, puffing out his chest, stepped forward. "A wise choice, Your Majesty. She is surprisingly resilient." The king's gaze shifted to the lord, and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. The look in his eyes was not anger. It was a vast, cold emptiness that promised oblivion. The lord physically recoiled, his face paling. "I was not addressing you," Kalen said, his voice soft as snowfall but sharp as a shard of ice. He turned his attention back to the auctioneer. "Send her to my chambers, now." He did not wait for a reply. He simply turned and walked away, the crowd parting before him once more like water before the prow of a great ship. Ilara stood frozen, the king's final words echoing in the stunned silence. Her world, which had been small and miserable, but at least predictable, had just been shattered. She was no longer a servant. She was no longer invisible. She was the Alpha King's prisoner. The room they gave her was a cage gilded in silk and silver. It was a suite at the top of the highest tower in the king's keep, a fortress of black stone that clawed at the sky. The bed was larger than the entire corner of the scullery where she used to sleep, piled high with furs so soft they felt like liquid against her skin. A fire roared in the hearth, a stark contrast to the permanent chill that seemed to have settled over the rest of the castle. Food was brought to her on silver trays, roasted meats, sweet fruits, warm bread, but it all tasted like ash in her mouth. She was a prisoner. The beautiful clothes laid out for her were a costume. The warmth of the fire was a lie. The door was made of iron-banded oak, and it was locked from the outside. She saw no one, not the king, not the guards who brought her meals and left them outside the door without a word. Days blurred into a silent, lonely twilight. She paced the confines of her luxurious prison, the silk of her new gowns whispering against the cold stone floors. Why? The question was a constant, maddening hum beneath the surface of her fear. Why her? The worthless scullery maid. What could he possibly want with her? The not knowing was a torture all its own. She imagined horrible fates, each one more gruesome than the last. He was a monster, the stories said. Perhaps he saved his victims, fattened them up before the slaughter. Her worthlessness was no longer a cloak. It was a gaping wound. He had seen her, and in doing so, he had made her visible to herself. And she did not like what she saw. A frightened girl, waiting for the axe to fall. On the 7th night, the routine changed. She was huddled in a chair by the fire, trying to absorb a warmth that would not penetrate the ice in her veins, when she heard it. A soft scratching at the door. Not the sound of a key or a guard's fist. A scratching, low and insistent. Her heart leaped into her throat. She froze, listening. It came again, a rasp of claw on thick wood. Terror warred with a desperate, foolish curiosity. She crept toward the door, her bare feet silent on the plush rug. She pressed her ear to the cold wood. On the other side, she could hear breathing. Deep, slow, and heavy. The breathing of a very large animal. A low whine echoed through the wood, a sound of profound longing and sorrow that startled her. It was not a sound of menace. It was a sound of pain. Slowly, cautiously, she knelt and peered through the large, ornate keyhole. What she saw made her gasp and pull back, her heart hammering. An eye, a massive, luminous golden eye, staring right back at her. It was not the gray eye of the king, but something wilder, more ancient. She scrambled away from the door, her back hitting the cold wall. The beast, the king's wolf. It was outside her door. It had found her. This was it. The end. She waited, her body trembling, for the sound of the door splintering, for the roar, the teeth, the final, tearing agony. Instead, she heard a soft metallic clink. The sound was so small, so out of place, that it took her a moment to process it. After another minute of pure, ringing silence, she forced herself back to the door. She knelt again, her hands shaking, and peered through the keyhole. The hallway was empty. But lying on the stone floor, directly in front of her door, was a key. A large iron key, glinting in the faint torchlight. It was impossible. The guards were posted at the end of the hall. No one could get to her door without them raising an alarm. No one except the beast. She stared at the key through the tiny hole, her mind reeling. Was this a trick? A test? Was the king playing some cruel game with her? The key was a promise, a question, a temptation. And after 7 days of silent, suffocating confinement, it was a temptation she could not resist. But how to get it? Her fingers were too thick to fit through the keyhole. Then she remembered the silver dining implements. She found a long, slender fork from her last untouched meal. With painstaking effort, her heart pounding with every scrape and clink, she worked the tines of the fork through the keyhole. It took what felt like an eternity, her muscles screaming in protest, but finally she managed to hook the ring of the key. Slowly, so slowly, she drew it back through the keyhole. It tumbled onto the rug with a soft thud. She snatched it up. The iron was strangely warm, as if it had been held in a living mouth. She stared at it, this impossible object. It was not the key to her own door. She had tried it, and it didn't fit. It was a key to somewhere else. The beast had brought her a key. Why? The next night, it happened again. The scratching. The low, mournful whine. The single golden eye in the keyhole. And then the soft clink of metal on stone. When she looked, a second key lay on the floor. Different from the first, smaller and more ornate. This became their ritual. Every night the beast would come. Every night it would leave a key. Every night she would painstakingly retrieve it. Her collection grew. A small brass key, a long skeletal one, a heavy rust-pitted key that looked ancient. Her prison was still a prison, but now it had a purpose. During the day, she studied the keys, tracing their shapes, feeling their weight. At night, after the beast had departed, she began to use them. Her terror was a living thing, a cold knot in her stomach. But her curiosity, and a desperate need to do something, was stronger. Holding a single flickering candle, she would slip out of her room, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The keys the beast brought her did not unlock the way out of the castle. They unlocked the way in. The first key opened a dusty, forgotten library. the air thick with the scent of decaying paper and leather. She lost herself for hours among the towering shelves, running her fingers over titles of books she could not read. Another key opened a barren observatory at the top of a winding stair, a telescope pointed at a sky perpetually obscured by clouds. Another led to a music room, where a harp stood shrouded in a white sheet like a ghost. She was exploring the king's castle, his life, his history. And she found only emptiness, dust, silence, neglect. It was the home of a man who had given up, a man waiting to die. With each nightly excursion, her fear of the beast lessened, replaced by a strange, poignant connection. It was not a monster. It was a guide. It was a lonely soul calling to another. It was showing her the truth of this place. One night, the beast left a key unlike any of the others. It was small, plain, and made of dark, unadorned iron. It felt different. It felt personal. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, where this key belonged. It was the key to the king's private wing. This was the final door, the one she was not meant to open. This was a line she could not uncross. She hesitated for a long time, the little iron key cold in her palm. The beast had brought her here. For what purpose? To lead her to her death? Or to something else? Taking a breath that felt like swallowing shards of glass, she chose to trust the beast. She found the door at the end of a long, dark corridor, unguarded. The castle's ever-present chill was stronger here. A palpable, biting cold that seemed to emanate from the wood of the door itself. Frost spiderwebbed across the iron hinges. Her hand trembled as she inserted the key. It turned with a quiet, well-oiled click. She pushed the door open and slipped inside, her candle flame guttering in the sudden draft. She had stepped into a world of ice. The room was a bedchamber, vast and opulent, but it was frozen. A layer of delicate, crystalline frost coated every surface. The heavy velvet curtains, the ornate carvings of the four-poster bed, the silver goblets on a side table. Her breath plumed in front of her face in a white cloud. The cold was so intense it was painful, stealing the air from her lungs. And in the center of it all, in the massive bed, was the king. He was lying on his back, on top of the fur covers, dressed only in simple black trousers. He was not sleeping. His eyes were open, staring at the canopy above, but they were unfocused, glazed over. His skin, where it was visible, was pale, almost blue, and dusted with a fine layer of frost. The slow, shallow rise and fall of his chest was the only sign he was still alive. The cold, she realized with a sickening jolt, was coming from him. It radiated from his body in waves, a living, malevolent force. This was his curse. Not a metaphor, not a story, a physical reality. He was being consumed by a winter that lived inside him. She took a hesitant step closer. He did not seem to notice her. His storm-gray eyes were fixed on something far away, something only he could see. His beautiful, harsh face was etched with a pain so profound it stole her breath. This was the Alpha King, the most powerful man in the world. And he was dying. Alone, in a room of his own making, freezing to death from the inside out. Her fear for herself vanished, burned away by a sudden, fierce surge of something else. Pity, compassion, a strange, inexplicable ache in her own chest that mirrored the sorrow in his eyes. She remembered the warmth of her fire, the one luxury she had. She had no power, no magic. She was nothing. But she could offer that. Without thinking, she moved to the fireplace in his room. It was cold, the logs unlit. Using her single candle, she managed to coax a small flame to life. It was a pathetic, struggling thing against the overwhelming cold of the room, but it was a start. She piled more wood onto it, nursing it, willing it to grow. The king's head turned slowly on the pillow. His eyes, hazy with pain, found her. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a flicker of confusion. Who? His voice was a dry rasp, weak and brittle. Ilara, she whispered, her own voice trembling. She didn't know why she gave her name. Prisoners didn't have names. He stared at her, his brows furrowing. The girl, from the block. A spasm of pain crossed his face, and a fresh wave of cold rolled through the room, making her teeth chatter. You should not be here. It is not safe. Neither should you, she countered softly, surprising herself with her own boldness. Freezing in your own bed. She looked from the struggling fire to him. The fire was not enough. He was the source of the cold. To fight it, she had to get closer. This was madness. He was the king. A monster, the stories said. But all she saw was a man in agony. She took a deep breath and walked to his bed. The cold intensified as she approached, a physical barrier pushing her away. It felt like wading into a frozen lake. She ignored it. She reached out a trembling hand and touched his arm. The cold was shocking, a searing pain that shot up her arm. It was not the simple absence of heat. It was an active, aggressive cold, alive and hungry. It felt like it was trying to devour the warmth from her very soul. She cried out and snatched her hand back. But in that brief moment of contact, she had felt something else. Beneath the crushing ice, a flicker. A tiny, buried ember of warmth. A spark of life fighting to survive. And he had felt it too. His eyes widened, the fog of pain clearing for a fraction of a second. What? The fire is not enough, she said, her voice steady despite the chattering of her teeth. She pulled a heavy fur from the bottom of the bed, one that hadn't yet succumbed to the frost. She wrapped it around her shoulders and sat on the edge of the mattress, deliberately placing herself within the heart of the cold. She would not touch him again. Not yet. But she would stay. She would be a witness. She would share the cold with him. Go, he rasped, his voice tight with effort. Leave me. No, she said quietly. The beast brought me the key. I think it wanted me to find you. His eyes, which had started to glaze over again, sharpened at her words. The beast? A wolf. With golden eyes. It comes to my door every night. A look of profound, weary understanding crossed his face. My wolf, he breathed. The only part of me that still remembers warmth. He closed his eyes. It is a fool. It will only lead you to your death alongside mine. Maybe, she said, pulling the fur tighter around herself. But I have been cold my whole life. At least here, there is a fire. She stayed until the dawn began to lighten the sky, a silent sentinel in his frozen room. As the sun rose, the intense cold seemed to recede slightly, and the frost on his skin began to melt. He finally fell into a true, exhausted sleep. Before she left, she placed another log on the fire. She slipped back to her tower, her body aching with a chill that felt bone deep. But her mind was clear for the first time in weeks. She was not a prisoner waiting for an executioner. She was a woman with a purpose. That night, the beast came again. The golden eye in the keyhole seemed softer somehow. It left no key. Its work was done. But Ilara went back. And the night after that, a new routine formed. During the day, she rested in her tower, gathering her strength. At night, she would go to him. She learned the rhythms of his curse. It was weakest in the hours after dawn and grew in strength as the sun set, peaking in the deep, silent hours after midnight. Those were the worst times, when the room became a tomb of ice, and he would lie awake, shivering and silent, his jaw clenched against the pain. She tended the fire, her one weapon against the encroaching winter. She began bringing things from her own luxurious prison. She brought him broth, holding the warm bowl in her hands until he finally, reluctantly, took a few sips. She brought him books from the library, reading aloud to him in a low voice, the sound of her words a small shield against the suffocating silence. He rarely spoke. He watched her. His storm-gray eyes followed her every movement. He watched her as she added logs to the fire, her face illuminated by the flames. He watched her as she read, her brow furrowed in concentration. He watched her, and for the first time in a century, he saw something other than the four frozen walls of his self-imposed prison. One night, the cold was worse than she had ever felt it. A storm raged outside, and it seemed to feed the winter inside him. He was racked with shudders, his teeth chattering uncontrollably, a low groan of agony escaping his lips. The fire seemed to shrink, its warmth swallowed by the oppressive chill. He was losing. The curse was winning. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced her. Not for herself, but for him. She could not let him die. She went to the bed. "Kalen," she said, using his name for the first time. It felt both strange and right on her tongue. His eyes were screwed shut in pain. He didn't respond. She knew what she had to do. It was a terrifying thought, a line she had sworn she would not cross again. But watching him suffer like this was worse. Taking a shuddering breath, she lay down on the bed beside him, on top of the covers. The cold was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. It was 1,000 times worse than just being in the room. It was an ocean of ice, and she was drowning in it. She reached out and laid her hand on his chest. The searing, hungry cold latched onto her, and she cried out, her whole body convulsing. It was agony, but she did not pull away. She gritted her teeth and held on, forcing her own small human warmth into him. Beneath her palm, she felt his heart beating, a slow, thready rhythm. And she felt that flicker again, that tiny, buried ember. She focused on it, pouring all of her will, all of her desperate hope, into that single point of contact. Something shifted. The cold that was attacking her seemed to hesitate. And through her hand, she felt a faint, answering pulse of warmth from him. It was infinitesimally small, but it was there. A single spark in a world of ice. His shudders began to subside. The chattering of his teeth quieted. He turned his head on the pillow, his gray eyes opening. They were clear, the fog of pain momentarily gone. He looked at her, lying beside him, her face pale and strained, her hand pressed against his heart. "Ilara," he whispered, his voice filled with a broken awe. "What are you doing?" "I don't know," she breathed, the words forming white puffs in the air. "Fighting." He reached up, his own hand clumsy and slow, and covered hers. His skin was still unnaturally cold, but where his fingers touched hers, it was not the aggressive, biting cold of the curse. It was just cold. The simple cold of a man who had been left in a frozen room for too long. "This is madness," he said, but there was no force in his words. "You will freeze." "I'm still here," she whispered. He held her gaze for a long moment, and in the depths of his storm-gray eyes, she saw the glacier of his loneliness finally begin to crack. A single, frozen tear traced a path from the corner of his eye, melting instantly where it touched the faint warmth of his skin. That night marked a turning point. Her presence, her touch, was a balm to his curse. It did not cure it, but it held it at bay. The more time she spent with him, the more the ice receded. Color returned to his cheeks. The frost on the furniture began to melt, leaving dark patches of moisture on the velvet and wood. They began to talk. Truly talk. He told her of the curse, an ancient blight passed down through his bloodline, a punishment for an ancestor's hubris. It lay dormant for generations, only to awaken in him with a terrible ferocity after the death of his family in a plague decades ago. The grief had been the key that unlocked its cage. She, in turn, told him of her life, of a mother who had always looked at her with a mixture of resentment and calculation, of a childhood spent being told she was a burden. She spoke of her worthlessness, laying the ugly, cold stone of it out between them in the quiet of the night. He listened, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, a long silence filled the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire. "They were fools," he said finally, his voice a low growl. "To have a jewel in their hands and mistake it for common stone." The words landed in the center of her chest, a sudden, shocking warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the first time anyone had ever defended her. The first time anyone had ever seen value in her. She didn't know what to do with it. She felt a blush creep up her neck, a sensation so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. Their nights became an island of warmth in a cold, hostile castle. He would read to her from the books she couldn't decipher, his deep voice weaving tales of ancient heroes and forgotten magic. She would describe the world outside the castle walls, the scent of rain on dry earth, the taste of a wild strawberry picked fresh from the vine, small, simple things he had long forgotten. She was falling in love with him. The realization did not come in a flash, but grew slowly, quietly, like the fire she tended each night. She was falling for the broken man, not the powerful king. For the lonely soul, not the feared monster. For the man whose wolf had trusted her before he had even known her name. She saw the same emotion mirrored in his eyes, in the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, in the gentle way he would take her hand, his touch still cool, but no longer dangerously so. But he never spoke of it. A wall remained, a barrier of duty and curse that he would not, or could not, cross. The peace was a fragile, beautiful thing, and like all beautiful things, it was doomed to be broken. A raven arrived, bearing a letter with a familiar, elegant seal. It was from her mother. Lyra was coming to the capital. She had heard the astonishing news of her daughter's elevation. She was coming to see for herself the good fortune that had befallen her dear, lost child. Alara felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with Kaelin's curse. Lyra was as beautiful and as poisonous as ever. She swept into the castle, all feigned concern and fluttering hands, exclaiming over Alara's fine clothes and luxurious prison. She treated Kaelin with a fawning deference that made Alara's skin crawl. "Oh, my poor, dear child," Lyra cooed, taking Alara's hands in hers. Her touch was cold. "To be trapped here with the king. You are so brave." Kaelin was stronger now, thanks to Alara. He was able to leave his chambers for short periods, to meet with his council and rule his kingdom. The unnatural cold still clung to him, but it was a faint aura, not a devouring storm. He greeted Lyra with a cool, regal politeness that gave nothing away. But Lyra saw. She had eyes like a hawk, and she saw the way he looked at Alara. She saw the fragile bond they had built in the frozen dark, and she saw it as a threat to her own unknown plans. The confrontation came in the throne room. Lyra had requested an audience with the king, with Alara present. Kaelin's treacherous advisor, Lord Lorcan, a man with a serpent smile, stood at her side. "Your Majesty," Lyra began, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I have come to you today out of a deep and abiding concern. For you, and for my daughter." She turned to Alara, her eyes filled with a chilling pity. "My dear, you have always been special. There are things about our bloodline I never told you. Things I hoped you would never need to know." A knot of ice formed in Alara's stomach. "Our family," Lyra announced to the silent court, "are descended from the very ones who first laid the curse of the frozen heart upon the king's ancestors." A wave of shock rippled through the room. Kaelin went rigid, his face becoming a mask of stone. "It was a terrible thing," Lyra continued, her voice trembling with practiced sorrow. A sin our family has carried for generations. The magic is in our blood, you see. Dormant, but present. She looked directly at Kaelin. And it is drawn to your own. Like moth to flame. Or rather, like winter to winter. She pointed a dramatic finger at Ilara. Her presence here is not healing you, your majesty. It is feeding the curse. Every moment she spends with you, her blood calls to the ice within you, making it stronger, deeper. She is not your salvation. She is your doom. A poison in the guise of a cure. The lie was so brilliant, so monstrous that Ilara could not even speak. It twisted the truth into a weapon, turning her care for him into an act of slow, deliberate murder. The truth about her identity, Lyra said, her voice ringing with triumph, is that she is the one thing in this world that can truly destroy you. The words hung in the air, deadly and sharp. Kaelin stared at Ilara, and for the first time in weeks, she saw the full, devastating force of the winter in his eyes. Doubt, fear, betrayal. He saw her horrified silence, her inability to deny the charge of her own bloodline, and he mistook it for guilt. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice terrible in its quiet control. I don't know," Ilara stammered. "I don't know anything about my bloodline." "A convenient ignorance," Lord Lorcan sneered. Kaelin looked from Ilara's panicked face to her mother's triumphant one. The pain of the perceived betrayal was a physical blow. The ice, which had been held at bay for so long, surged back with a vengeance. Frost crept across the floor from his feet. The torches in the room sputtered as the cold consumed their warmth. He had been a fool. A lonely, dying fool who had mistaken a serpent for a songbird. He had let her into his frozen heart, and she had been poison all along. The pain of it was worse than the cold. "Take her," he commanded, his voice cracking like a sheet of ice. He would not look at her. He could not. "Take her and her mother from my sight. Banish them. If they are ever seen in my lands again, they will be executed." The words were a death sentence. Ilara felt the world tilt on its axis. "Kaelin, no!" she cried, reaching for him. "It's a lie. Please." Guards seized her arms. She fought, a wild, desperate strength born of love and terror, but it was no use. They dragged her from the throne room, her pleas echoing off the cold stone walls. The last thing she saw was his back, turned against her, a column of frozen, unbreachable misery. The villain had won. Her mother had succeeded in tearing them apart. As they dragged her out of the castle gates and threw her onto a dirt road, her fine clothes already stained with mud, Ilara felt a cold deeper than any she had ever known. Kaelin's curse was a tangible thing. This despair, this utter hopelessness, was infinitely worse. Cast out and alone, Ilara walked. She walked until her feet bled, until the fine silk gown was in tatters. She had nothing. No home, no name, no purpose. The warmth Kaelin had sparked in her was extinguished, leaving only a hollow ache. She wandered into the deep woods that bordered his kingdom, surviving on nuts and berries, and the kindness of the forest creatures that seemed unafraid of her. The rage she should have felt toward her mother was a dull, heavy weight, too exhausting to even lift. All she felt was grief. Days turned into weeks. She grew thin, feral. One evening, huddled under the roots of an ancient oak tree, she heard a faint whimpering. She followed the sound to a small clearing and found it. A tiny wolf pup, no bigger than her two hands, shivering violently. Its black fur was matted, and when she touched it, she felt a familiar, unnatural cold. It was cursed, just like Kaelin. A fierce, protective instinct she didn't know she possessed surged through her. She scooped up the tiny creature, holding it against her chest, trying to share her own meager body heat. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. "I've got you." This pup became her reason to live. She hunted for it, chewed food to make it soft enough to eat, and held it through the nights as the cold fits racked its tiny body. She was performing a small-scale version of the care she had given the king, and the ache in her heart eased, just a little. She was so focused on the pup that she didn't hear the footsteps until it was too late. Well, well, look what the forest coughed up. Alara looked up, her blood turning to ice. It was her mother, Lyra, looking as elegant as ever, flanked by two grim-faced mercenaries. Lord Lorcan was not with her. This was personal. "I knew you wouldn't have the good sense to simply die," Lyra said, her lip curling in distaste as she took in Alara's ragged appearance. "What do you want?" Alara asked, clutching the shivering pup to her chest. "What I have always wanted," Lyra said, her voice dropping, losing its public grace and taking on a raw, hungry edge. "The power in our blood. The power you so carelessly squander." She stepped closer. "Our ancestor didn't just curse the king's line, she bound a piece of our own life force to it. A key, waiting for a lock. With the king dead, the power he holds, the ancient magic of the Alpha Kings, will be released. And our bloodline, the bloodline of the curse maker, will be the only one able to claim it. I will be a goddess, Alara." It all clicked into place. The lies, the betrayal, the exile. "But you," Lyra continued, her eyes gleaming with madness, "you and your sentimental heart were in the way. You were strengthening him, reversing the process. And now, I'm afraid, I have to clean up my own mess." She nodded to the mercenaries. "Kill her. And the mutt." The men advanced. Alara scrambled backward, her heart pounding. This was it. The final, pathetic end to her worthless life. She was going to die in the dirt, for nothing. She looked down at the pup in her arms. It whimpered, its small body convulsing with the cold. She thought of Kaelin, alone in his frozen room, the ice claiming him completely now that she was gone. And something inside her broke. The rage she had suppressed for a lifetime, at her mother, at the world, at her own perceived worthlessness, surged up. It was a hot, cleansing fire. But as it reached its peak, as she prepared to snarl and fight and die, she looked at her mother's twisted, hateful face, and the rage was suddenly gone, replaced by an overwhelming, soul-deep pity. Her mother was the one who was truly worthless, a hollow thing, chasing power she could never truly hold. In that moment, Alara let go. She let go of the anger. She let go of the hurt. She let go of the need for an apology she would never receive. She forgave her. Not for Lyra's sake, for her own. "I'm sorry for you," Alara whispered. The release was a physical sensation, like a dam breaking inside her soul. The world went silent. The air crackled, and the power of her bloodline, the power her mother had coveted, a power not of curses but of connection, awoke. It was not fire or lightning, it was life. A wave of golden light erupted from her, soft and warm. It was the scent of spring rain and new-growth pine and the warmth of the sun on sleeping stone. It was the power of spirit, of ancestral connection, not to a curse, but to the land itself. The light washed over the mercenaries and they stopped, their hard faces softening with confusion, the killing intent forgotten. It washed over the wolf pup in her arms and its shivering ceased. The unnatural cold in its fur vanished, replaced by a vibrant, living warmth. Lyra shrieked as the light touched her, recoiling as if from a physical blow. The power did not recognize her hate-filled heart. A new sound cut through the clearing, a howl. Not the mournful cry of a lonely beast, but the full-throated roar of an alpha king. Kaelin crossed the clearing in 3 long strides, his eyes never leaving hers. He stopped before her, his big frame trembling. He reached out a hand, not to touch her, but to feel the warmth of the light she projected. "You are not a curse," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were always the cure." "And you," she whispered, her own tears finally falling, "were never a monster." He gently took the healed pup from her arms, cradling it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Then, with his other hand, he cupped her face. His skin was warm, truly, wonderfully warm. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was not about passion, but about homecoming. It was a promise, a beginning, a prayer answered in the deep of winter. In the center of the forest, surrounded by the golden light of her reborn spirit, the Alpha King and his hidden queen were finally reunited. The cold was broken. The prison was gone. All that remained was love. Months later, the northern wastes were transformed. The perpetual winter that had clung to the land receded. Green shoots pushed through the thawing earth. The sky, once a perpetual sheet of gray, was a brilliant, piercing blue. The castle was no longer a cold, Gothic tomb. The windows were thrown open, letting in the sunlight and the scent of the healing land. Laughter, a sound not heard in a century, echoed in the halls. Alara stood on a balcony, a soft breeze playing with her hair. She was no longer a prisoner, no longer a servant. She was a queen, loved by her people, her quiet strength and gentle power having healed not just their king, but their home. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and she leaned back into the familiar warmth of Kaelin's chest. He nuzzled her neck, his breath warm against her skin. "What is my beautiful queen thinking about?" he murmured, his voice still a low rumble, but now filled with a warmth that matched the sun. "I was thinking about keys," she said softly, "and how sometimes the right one doesn't let you out, but lets you in." He smiled against her hair. "My wolf always was the wisest part of me." A happy yip drew their attention. At their feet, a strapping young wolf, his coat a glossy black, chased his own tail. The pup she had saved had become their constant, joyous companion. Kaelin turned her in his arms, his storm-gray eyes soft with a love that was still new, still miraculous. "I love you, Alara of the Northern Wastes," he said, the words as solemn and binding as any royal decree. "And I love you, Kaelin," she replied, her hand coming up to rest over his heart, feeling the strong, steady, warm beat beneath her palm. She had been his prisoner, his beast had brought her the key. But in the end, it was her love that had set them both free.